You really can't have a course or a module on installing an operating system without the perfunctory slide here on the minimum requirements to install that OS. And this information here may be useful for your own trivia knowledge. It may be useful if you're planning on, I don't know, passing an exam, for example. But the reality here is that a lot of the minimum install requirements for Server 2016 are very little changed from what we saw in previous versions of the OS. I'll show you here that we have, for example, the need for a 1.4 gigahertz x64 processor with support for all these processor features that you can see here on the screen. The reality is that just about every machine that you plan on installing Windows Server 2016 onto probably supports all of these processor features already. These are by no means bleeding edge features that you probably need to prepare for as you figure out which servers can accept this OS. If you do have an x64 processor that supports at least 1.4 gigahertz, well, you'll probably be fine in getting the OS installed anyway. In addition to these processor features, we also have to have second-level address translation support, or SLAT support, either the EPT or NPT version of SLAT support. This will be necessary if you plan on doing any virtualization on top of that instance of Windows Server. SLAT is required generally for the use by Hyper-V, and so you'll want to make sure that your processors support SLAT, usually either the Intel VT extensions or the equivalent AMD extensions, so that you can support the use of those virtual machines on top of that hypervisor host. There are, as you know, two different installation options for Server 2016, the Server Core and also the Full Server Edition. For Server Core, you need to have at least 512 megabytes of RAM. For every other edition, for the Server with a GUI edition, you'll need to have at least 2 gigs of RAM. This needs to be ECC type or similar RAM. We also here have the need for hard disk space, at least 32 gigs of hard disk space, and a gigabit Ethernet NIC that is compliant to PCI Express and also supports PXE for PXE booting. You should notice here that a couple of these, the RAM and also the hard disk space configurations here, both of these have little asterisks associated with them. I include these asterisks here because I want to direct your attentions up here to Microsoft's website, where we can see some of the system requirements for the installation here of Server 2016. And I want to direct your attention down here to just exactly what those asterisks actually mean. Down here, again, you can take a look at this there on the Microsoft website. It may be slightly different at the moment you're actually watching this video. But if I scroll down just a bit here to the processor requirements and then also to the RAM requirements, the very first of these asterisks is highlighted here in this yellow box. Now, the situation where you find yourself actually attempting to create a Windows Server instance with only a half a gig of RAM, those instances are probably going to be relatively few and far between. You usually, whatever workload is on top of that machine, is going to require just a bit more RAM than the absolute minimum that you can actually put there for the OS. But if you do have need to minimize the total RAM consumption for that OS instance, you can see here that the 512 megabytes is actually needed for the operation of Windows Server. You need to have just a tiny bit more, 800 megabytes, to actually go through the setup of Windows Server. So our first asterisk here just mentions the fact that that 512 is something you might actually need to throttle down towards after you complete that initial installation. I also want to direct your attentions down here to the second of these boxes, in this case the blue box right here under our storage requirements. It is here where Microsoft gives us kind of a reality check on this 32 gigabytes as the minimum value for the servers you're building. Microsoft notes here in the blue box, as you can see, that the 32 gigabytes should be considered an absolute minimum value. This is absolutely the minimum amount of hard disk space that Windows Server itself may require for operation. And so if you plan on doing really anything at all with that copy of Windows Server, again, a reality check here is that you're probably going to need more hard disk space to support those functions. And so, as I mentioned here before, this review of these absolute minimums more has to do with trivia, or if you're planning on maybe needing test questions, than really for any production implementation of Windows Server that you may see in your actual environment.